G'day ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another Warframe guide. This time we're back with a Redux guide, where I go back to a video that doesn't quite meet my standards, and we make fun of how bad the old videos were, and then do a redo of them so that we can get a more insightful look at how these frames work. As always, these frames are subject to change, so the guides may be remade again in the future to accommodate those changes. Because DE just love changing things, don't they? Not that that's necessarily a bad thing. This is a beginner's guide though, so we're going to be going over the basics and all the things that new players would benefit from knowing to get the most out of the frames we discuss, and making sure everything is obtainable or doable for somebody who has only just picked up the game. So we're not looking at things like umbral builds, we're just looking at the min-maxing for a new player. Rhino, otherwise known as the new player frame. This guy is amazing, and I can attest to that title because I played nothing but Rhino for 2 years when I first picked up the game. And when I did first, I utilised his survivability to make him a lot more reliable when it comes to looking at the chat. Because I used to often die a lot when I used to play other frames, and I'd get distracted going, "Ooh, chat, what's going on today? Oh, hi, chat." So Rhino's survivability is very good for that sort of functionality. So he can soak up damage and hopefully not die, giving you time to re-chat for 5 minutes. So why is he so good for a new player, you ask? Well, simply put, he's a jack of all trades, but a master of none. But can specialise when needed, being able to focus on survivability or maybe focusing more on crowd control. On top of that as well, he's also obtained so early on in the game as well, which really adds to that value of helping new players pick up a frame that can really help boost them through the early game content and the star chart. There are currently 3 main ways that I personally play Rhino, and we're going to take a look at each of these playstyles, bearing in mind that when it comes to these playstyles, there are almost infinite micro adjustments you can make within them to adjust them to your preferred playstyle. Playstyle 1. So the first playstyle we're looking at is a crowd control preference. With Rhino's Stomp and knockdowns, you have some amazing avenues to go into supporting your team, while trying to hold down a location or trying to keep enemies under control. Rhino's crowd control on his 4 is a Stomp, and his charge on his 1 then also scale immensely well with range, and with that can tailor themselves nicely to synergize with each other. And when it comes to the Stomp, this will pretty much remove any enemy from play that's affected by it that comes into contact with the Stomp or gets knocked down from the charge. And because you're modding range for these abilities in the first place, the distance you carry with your charge is going to be very substantial. And the charge itself not only can then add to the CC with the knockdown of the enemies, but then they fly away in a hilarious fashion and ragdoll like some demented chimpanzee. But it also adds to the distance you travel, giving you some movement utility. So if you really want to get out of a situation you may not enjoy, like being hunted by a level 9,999 stalker that pops into your mission and tries to eat your operator's brains. Anyway, this playstyle won't buff or have a stupidly strong Ironskin, but it will make up for that with an augment called Ironclad Charge, which we'll talk about later. This in turn will supplement the lack of defense, and if enemies are constantly CC'd, they're not going to be attacking you in the first place, right? Personally, I love using this build, as even without modding into them, your defense and your buffs are still somewhat relevant to give your team a help and also keep your survivability going. The second playstyle we're going to look at is a playstyle that says screw you to your entire team, and you build as little as range as possible, but build as much power strength as feasibly obtainable to buff yourself with as big of an Ironskin as possible and as big of a self-buff as possible from your 3. This is something that works immensely well for Eidolons as well, and for solo play. The third and final playstyle that often new players will find themselves walking into is sort of a hybrid playstyle that works mostly on survival. This is something that a lot of players will just naturally work themselves into, as it's the way Rhino sort of tailors himself to giving a player an idea of how to play. This kind of ties nicely into playstyle 2, but it also is quite unique to itself as well, as there are some augments and utility to this that won't work as well for a pure buff build. With this, you prioritize building as much armor as feasibly possible with some power strength to then utilize those Ironskin and buff. You then add in some range to make sure it's still somewhat useful for your allies in terms of the buff potential, giving your allies that lovely potency from the 3, as well as getting some distance on your charge and still being able to crowd control with your 4. With a decent build, even level 100 enemies will have trouble killing you with a playstyle of this nature, and the stronger you make the Ironskin, the more likely you are to survive in those high levels as well. Although you do want to watch out for nullifiers in any playstyle with Rhino, but this is something that is just sort of a natural thing you'll get used to as you pick the game up. This playstyle works immensely well for solo play, or if you're trying to push for high levels of a team, And goddamn, it just makes life easy. And what's even easier is he comes from Venus on Fossa. That one of the first maps you'll likely get your hands on and one of the first bosses you will likely fight in the game. There couldn't be an easier frame to obtain. So early, so easy to farm, and yet alone the fight itself of the Jackal, I believe it's called, is actually even easier because he's literally just a giant robot where you shoot the legs out. And yeah, I mean, if you've seen my boss guide, you'll understand how this works. So in terms of general statistics of how Rhino stomps onto your screen, at level 30 he'll come at you with his normal version with 300 health, 450 shields, 190 armor, which is statistically is one of the highest base armor values of any frame in the game, especially for the default versions. 150 energy, 0.95 sprint speed, 2 Vazarin polarities, and a Madori polarity in the aura slot. The Prime variant will come at you with the same amount of health and shields at 300 health, 450 shields, but a massive increase in armor at 275 armor value, which will really help that Ironskin potency. 150 energy, 1.0 sprint speed, 2 Vazarin polarities, 1 Naramon polarity, so that added polarity, and a Madori polarity. And unfortunately, the Prime variant is vaulted, so you will have to go out of your way to try and find the relics, or hope that it gets unvaulted at some point in the near future. Hey guys, how do you stop a Rhino from charging? You take away his credit card. Sorry. Rhino's one is charge. Rhino's charge is quite simple. Just going to unpause the enemies here. Rhino charges forwards for 12 meters at a speed of 48 meters per second. Enemies within 2 meters of Rhino are dealt 650 impact damage, and if Rhino's charge is successfully cast within a window of 1 second after the previous cast, its damage will be multiplied by 200%. Its charge range will be multiplied by 125%, and I'll fall off the edge apparently, and its energy cost will be reduced by 50%. Any successful cast thereafter will multiply Rhino's charge damage by 400%, and multiply its charge range by 150%, and it reduces its energy cost by 75%. And if Ironskin is active, the damage of Rhino's charge will have 100% status chance for blast status effect. So you want to synergize this to make sure you have them all active at the same time, and you get that extra little lovely knockback from the blast effect. Rhino's charge deals an additional 100% damage to enemies that are affected by the Stomp. So this is an ability we'll look at in a moment, but if enemies are held in the air, like so, assuming they're still here, they will then take additional damage as well. There's a lot of potency here should you line up the damage properly. The augment for Rhino's charge is called Ironclad charge. Each enemy hit by your charge increases Rhino's armor value by 50% for 10 seconds. So like I said earlier, you want range with this to hit as many enemies as possible. The armor bonus is affected by power strength, and the duration of said buff is affected by power duration. So doing this, then casting Ironskin to get an even bigger Ironskin is a very advisable way of doing this. The buff also works then in synergy with having a range and crowd control build to subsidize the fact that your Ironskin isn't going to be innately as powerful as it would be normally if you went for a more power strength armor-based build. Rhino's 2 is Ironskin. Rhino basically creates a shield type buff with a 1200 health value around himself. Rhino's total armor is multiplied by 250% and is also added to the buffer health of this shield. Ironskin also causes Rhino to become invulnerable for 3 seconds after the initial cast. All incoming damage is absorbed, kind of like how Nez's does, and during the invulnerability period is then converted into the health of this shield. While the Ironskin is active, Rhino becomes immune to damage and status effects. Ironskin will expire when the buffer's health is... The remaining value of this shield is shown as a buff in the top right, as well as also as a percentage on the ability bar down in the bottom right. This is a hugely powerful buff, and you can really easily abuse this with the invulnerability period to cast this ability to have a blissful second of immunity if something big is heading your way. But in turn, you want to definitely steer clear of nullification because this might very well just completely ruin your day. The augment for Ironskin is called Iron Shrapnel. Recasting your Ironskin will then detonate the skin, dealing 100% of its remaining health as puncture damage and knocking down all enemies within 8 meters. The power of this buff is dictated by your power strength mixed with a portion with the overall percentage of your Ironskin. So building some power strength will really make this deal a crap ton of damage. The range of the knockdown is also affected by ability range. So not only does this allow you to also cast your Ironskin on the move and refresh it if you run out of stacks. Like, if, for example, if your Ironskin drops down too far and you feel like, hey, maybe I just want to recast this, not only is there some very potent damage and potential wave clear from the range you can get from this, but it also means that you'll be able to pick and choose when you recast your Ironskin, which is actually really, really nice. Not to mention, as you can see, the damage is quite substantial as well. The damage of the Ironskin is Iron Shrapnel, isn't going to scale tremendously well above level 60 to 70 because it's puncture based, but for being able to recast your Ironskin on the move, it is extremely useful. Raw is Rhino's 3, and I'm going to explain this before we demonstrate it, because it's worth showing before and after of how good this is. Rhino lets out a gigantic roar and increases the output of all his allies within a 25-meter radius. Affected allies will gain 50% bonus damage to all sources over the duration of 30 seconds. Keep in mind, this is multiplicative, meaning it is a very powerful buff and will add to the total damage rather than just being a flat-out buff. So, the way to look at this is, if we look at our DPSs here, if they want to start shooting the enemy, the damage they deal is not a lot against these guys right now. As we can see, they are taking some damage, but it's not tremendous. You've got to keep in mind as well, these weapons are completely unmodded, so they're not dealing a tremendous amount of damage right off the bat. Okay, so if we just want to hold up there a sec, guys, let's move down to these other group down here so we can show this a bit more in a confined manner. So if I activate my buff now, our allies will then gain this wonderful power strength buff, like so. And if they want to start blasting away now, the potency now goes up exponentially by 152%. So on big chunky weapons, this tends to show itself a lot better. On weapons like Vectis, sniper rifles, shotguns, you'll notice a lot bigger of a change because of the way it scales. On smaller weapons with high DPS but low base damage, it won't scale as tremendously well. So if we go over here again, we'll show once more. Now the damage boost, as mentioned, is generated by the power strength you have. The duration of said buff is generated by the duration you build. The range is affected by power range, and multiple roars do not stack, however. But a stronger roar will overwrite a weaker one, so it's worth communicating between your allies to make sure that it's generally better just to bring one with you. Although if you do bring two, maybe you'll be able to cover a large area, but you always want to maybe discuss between yourselves who brings the Rhino with the strongest buff. The augment for Roar is called Piercing Roar. Enemies within 25 meters will suffer from a 150 damage puncture proc. The damage of this buff is affected by power strength. The range of the effect is affected by ability range. Not very much used for damaging, but the puncture proc to weaken enemies is very useful. So not only does this now give you a buff for your allies and yourself, but it then weakens the enemies as well. So it just gives it that extra little bit of potency while maybe giving a bit of damage for lower level missions. I would not want to use this for high level missions, but it does then synergize quite nicely with some of your other augments, allowing you to then kill off your enemies much more efficiently like so. Rhino's 4 is quite simple and straightforward, but extremely useful. It's called Rhino Stomp. Stompy, 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 stompy. Rhino stomps the ground, dealing 800 blast damage in a 5-meter radius. After a short delay, enemies within the radius of 25 meters are affected by the same amount of damage and effect. Affected enemies are forced into a tumble with their movements, slowed by 97.5% over the duration of 8 seconds. The damage of this is affected by ability strength, the range of which and radius of the area affected is affected by ability range, and the stasis or the tumble duration that they're affected by is affected by ability duration. So building range and duration makes this a very, very optimal build to go for. And this is the sort of thing that you're going to use if you may see that you want to maybe keep control of an area, lock down an area or something of that nature. Again, remembering back that your charge affects enemies affected by this quite nicely. So for example, if we have some enemies that are stunned like this, your charge then affects them even more so. And then you have free reign to do whatever you wish to them, whether you want to kill them, knock them away with your charge, or just run away like a little pussy. And the final augment for Rhino is called Reinforcing Stomp. Ironskin's health is replenished by 80 for each enemy affected by your stomp. A great augment to work in conjunction with your Ironskin. And if you don't have Iron Shrapnel, can then in turn allow you to maybe not need to recast your Ironskin, but just keep it on the refresh level. So as you can see, we went from 30% of an Ironskin to 76% in a single stomp. So using this in conjunction with a range build to affect as many enemies as possible will keep your Ironskin very healthy. Or even with a minimum range build, just Ironskinning and then affecting 1 or 2 enemies can then keep it healthy and hopefully make it not fall off as quickly as it would do normally. Bearing in mind that Ironskin and Stomp are very much limited by your build, so you've got to sort of dictate how you use this augment with the build you're using. You see a lot of usefulness with these augments being tied together. For example, as we mentioned earlier, even with Ironclad Charge, you can synergize that with Iron Shrapnel. So if you went for a range build, you would charge to build up your armor buff from your Ironclad Charge. You would then Ironskin to get a much bigger Ironskin, and then using Iron Shrapnel, you would have a huge damage boost from that explosion from Iron Shrapnel. Obviously, that does mean you need to be very selective on the mods you replace them with, because that will mean that you'll need to take out 2 mods to fill in for those augments. It can be a nice gimmick, and there is a lot of synergy between each augment. It's just down to you to find which one and which way you want to play with them. And last but not least, we're going to have a quick look at these builds individually. So this build right here is a build that I've been using since the days of the raids. This is a very efficient, very useful range build that will work tremendously well with crowd control and very long distance charges. So you could then swap out Augur Message to fit in one of the augments for Iron Shrapnel. And if you chose to synergize that with the Iron Shrapnel, like we mentioned a moment ago, you could then swap out potentially Narrow-Minded to get that bonus range for even more of a distance, but that's entirely down to you. The main facet with this build is you want as much range as possible, as much duration as possible. So we've got Stretch, Cunning Drift, we've got Overextended for the range. You do take a bit of a hit with range because of Narrow-Minded, but that duration more than makes up for it. This is also why I've gone for 2 levels down, just to free up some capacity and also have that slight range brought back from not having it completely fully leveled. Because you're going very caster heavy with this build, and you'll be casting your 4 and your 1 very frequently, flow is very good for this kind of build, so that you can cast a lot on the fly. Whereas with your other builds, if you're prioritizing Ironskin or the buff, you're not going to be casting them as frequently, so flow may not be as viable for those other builds. But as mentioned, all of these builds we're about to look at, they all have a lot of micro adjustments you can make to them. So you sort of change them based on how you play with them. These are just the ways that builds that I have got into and how I found they work for me. The second build, this is a bit more of a specific build. This one we're looking at right now is actually my very specific Eidolon buff build. This gives you a massive buff in terms of your 3, as well as a tremendously powerful Ironskin. If you were playing solo, this would work immensely well. However, you can then swap out certain mods to make this more viable for buffing your allies. You would swap out things like Armored Agility, maybe potentially Intensify for some range, just to make sure your allies can benefit from that buff more evidently. This build would also then work immensely well with Iron Shrapnel, as you have a huge amount of an Ironskin to then detonate on your enemies. And if you do then swap out some range, you can then have that potently knock down enemies as well. The final build we're looking at is a hybrid build. This is a build that would work tremendously well for newer players. It covers an asset of almost every part of what Rhino plays to. You've got some armor to help boost that Ironskin. You've got some duration to help boost the duration of your crowd control and your buff. You've got a little bit of power strength to help boost the potency of your Ironskin again, to deal a little bit more damage, to also then have a slightly stronger stomp. You have the augment slot, which could essentially be anything. You could put this in place of a range mod if you want to prioritize a little bit more on the stability of your buffs and your crowd control. And in place of the, you can really like this is so much of a playable build that you can sort of take out what you want, put in what you want. And you'll notice that I'm sort of going through this quite quickly. That is because these builds are so cookie cutter like that there's no one specific way you can build Rhino that is correct. You play to the way you feel that works, and you can sort of start with one of these builds and sort of fiddle around with it until it works for you. So thank you for watching this video, guys. Hopefully this new and improved Rhino guide has been an improvement over the old one. You can leave a comment down in the comment segment down below to let me know if you enjoy it more than the last one. That would actually help me greatly as well, because these videos are sort of expanding to a new threshold where we're sort of holding them to a much higher standard. And I would greatly appreciate to know what you think of them. Also, if you would like to come and join us, these lovely fellows beside me here, these guys joined us from our Twitch stream, and you can join us as well, should you wish. I will leave a link to our Twitch channel down below, where we actively get our community involved in making these videos and helping shape how they end up turning out. So, from the people from Twitch, from the people who took part with the video itself, I thank you for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Leave a like, maybe share it to a friend, and I'll see all of you top hatters in the next episode. Ta-ra!